An 11-year-old vanishes in broad daylight. 18 years later, it turns out police had stood 30 feet from her more than 60 times. This is not just a kidnapping story. It's a blueprint for how a system fails, and how two ordinary women finally broke it open. On June 10, 1991, an 11-year-old girl was pulled into a gray sedan in broad daylight while walking to her school bus stop. Her stepfather chased the car on a bicycle until his lungs gave out. Law enforcement launched one of the largest child abduction investigations in California history. Helicopters circled the mountains. Search dogs combed forests for months. The FBI joined within hours. America's Most Wanted aired her case within 4 days. Pink ribbons appeared on trees across the entire state. And for 18 years, no one found her. Not because she was hidden in some remote wilderness. Not because she had been smuggled across international borders. But because she was locked in a backyard compound 170 miles away, in a suburban neighborhood where registered sex offender parole officers visited more than 60 times and never looked past the front door. This is the story of Jaycee Lee Dugard, a case that exposes not only unthinkable cruelty, but a system failure so catastrophic it would lead to a complete overhaul of sex offender supervision in California. And it would take two women with nothing but gut instinct to finally crack it open. If cases like this matter to you, if you believe these stories need to be told, hit that like button, drop a comment with your thoughts, and subscribe to Cold Case Beacon so you never miss an investigation that refuses to be forgotten. Jaycee Lee Dugard was born on May 3, 1980, in Anaheim, California. Her mother, Terry Probin, raised her primarily as a single parent following a brief relationship with Jaycee's biological father, Kenneth Slayton, who was not involved in her upbringing. When Jaycee was 7 years old, Terry married Carl Probin, a carpet contractor. The couple welcomed a daughter, Shayna, in 1989, giving Jaycee a younger half-sister. In September 1990, the family made a deliberate choice. They packed up and left the suburbs of Los Angeles, relocating to Myers, a small rural community just south of South Lake Tahoe in the Sierra Nevada mountains. This was not a casual move. The Probins chose this location for one specific reason: safety. They believed the quiet, pine-covered hills and tight-knit community would provide a safer environment for raising their daughters, away from the dangers of urban life. South Lake Tahoe in the early 1990s was a picturesque resort town known for its stunning lake views, winter skiing, and year-round outdoor lifestyle. Myers was even more secluded, with winding roads flanked by tall evergreens. Families let their children walk short distances to school bus stops without worry. It was the kind of place where people moved to feel safe. It was the kind of place where nothing bad was supposed to happen. Jaycee was adapting well. She was an 11-year-old fifth grader at Myers Elementary School. A shy blonde girl with blue eyes, standing approximately 4 feet 6 inches tall and weighing around 80 pounds. She had freckles, a small gap between her front teeth, a chickenpox scar between her eyes, and a distinctive butterfly-shaped birthmark on her right arm. Her favorite color was pink. She wore pink outfits constantly, and that detail, that simple preference for one color, would later become a symbol of hope for an entire community. On the morning of Monday, June 10, 1991, everything seemed ordinary. Terry Probin left early for her job as a typesetter at a printing house. Jaycee dressed in her favorite all-pink ensemble, pink windbreaker, pink stretch pants, pink shoes. She kissed her stepfather goodbye and started her usual walk uphill along Washone Boulevard toward the school bus stop. It was a short walk from their home, a route she had taken dozens of times. Carl Probin stood in the garage, watching Jaycee as she walked away. He later said she looked happy, skipping a bit as she headed up the hill. It was around 8:10 in the morning. A crisp, clear mountain morning. Then a car appeared. Witnesses, including Carl from his vantage point and schoolchildren already waiting at the bus stop, described it as a mid-sized gray sedan, possibly a Mercury Monarch or similar model, two-tone gray. The vehicle made a U-turn at the top of the hill and pulled up alongside Jaycee. Carl saw two people inside, a man driving and a woman in the passenger seat. The woman opened the door, reached out, grabbed Jaycee, and pulled her into the car. Jaycee screamed. She kicked. Carl heard her cries clearly from the garage. He later told investigators he could hear her calling his name. Carl. Carl. Over and over as the car pulled away. It was a sound he would carry for the rest of his life. He immediately jumped on his bicycle and pedaled as hard as he could, chasing the car uphill as it sped away. But a bicycle cannot outrun a car. Carl could not catch up. Exhausted and panicked, he turned back, sprinted to a neighbor's house, and called 911. "My stepdaughter's been kidnapped," he shouted. A gray car just grabbed her off the street. Other witnesses confirmed every detail. Children at the bus stop watched the entire abduction unfold. One described the woman forcing Jaycee into the back seat. Another saw the car speed down the mountain road and disappear. Law enforcement responded within minutes. El Dorado County Sheriff's deputies arrived on scene and immediately began securing the area and interviewing Carl Probin and the child witnesses. The descriptions were consistent: gray sedan, older model, 2 occupants, a man and a woman. The search launched that same day. Local volunteers joined deputies to comb surrounding woods and neighborhoods. Helicopters circled overhead. Search dogs were deployed. Roadblocks went up on major routes out of the Tahoe Basin. The community was stunned. Abductions in plain view, in broad daylight, were rare and terrifying. By afternoon, the story hit local media. Flyers with Jaycee's photo, a smiling girl in pink, began circulating. And then something remarkable happened. Pink ribbons started appearing. On trees. On porches. On mailboxes. On car antennas. Throughout South Lake Tahoe, throughout the entire region, pink became a symbol of hope and solidarity. The FBI entered the case quickly due to its nature, a child abduction with potential for crossing state lines. Agents assisted with canvassing and interviewed dozens of residents. Tips flooded in. Possible sightings of gray sedans. Reports of suspicious vehicles in the area. The first 48 hours were a controlled frenzy. El Dorado County Sheriff's Office, supported by California Highway Patrol and the FBI, treated this as what it was, a stranger abduction requiring every available resource. Search teams spread across the Tahoe Basin. Ground units walked grid patterns through dense pine forests. K-9 units, both tracking dogs and cadaver dogs, were brought in from Sacramento and Reno. Helicopters with infrared cameras scanned for heat signatures. Divers searched lakes and reservoirs. Off-road vehicles covered remote logging roads. Roadblocks were set up on highways 50 and 89, the 2 primary escape routes. Officers stopped every gray sedan that even remotely matched witness descriptions. Trunks were checked. Drivers were questioned. Hundreds of vehicles were inspected in those first days. None led anywhere. Investigators compiled composite sketches based on eyewitness accounts. Carl Probin had seen the woman's face clearly as she grabbed Jaycee. The children at the bus stop provided matching details: white female, approximately 30 to 40 years old, long dark or brownish hair, wearing a floral or patterned top. The male driver was described as white, possibly in his 40s, with dark hair. The vehicle remained consistent across all reports: older gray sedan, possibly with wood grain panels or front-end damage. By June 12, the FBI formally took over coordination under federal kidnapping statutes. Special agents from Sacramento set up a command post at the El Dorado County Sheriff's substation. For days after the abduction, on June 14, America's Most Wanted aired a full segment. Host John Walsh described the brazen daylight kidnapping, displayed the composite sketches, showed Jaycee's school photo, and included dramatic reenactments. The show appealed directly to viewers nationwide. The response was immediate. Hundreds of calls flooded the dedicated hotline overnight. Tip lines were established locally and through the FBI. Within 1 week, more than 500 leads came in. Some were dead ends, people reporting gray cars from weeks earlier, neighbors with old grudges. But others demanded immediate follow-up. One caller claimed to see a gray sedan with a screaming child at a remote turnout near Echo Summit hours after the abduction. Search teams and dogs were dispatched. They found nothing. Another lead centered on a gray Mercury Monarch spotted in Placerville the day after the kidnapping. The vehicle matched the description precisely, including wood grain trim. Deputies located the owner, a local man with no criminal record. He was interviewed extensively. His alibi checked out through coworkers. The car was thoroughly examined. No evidence connected it to Jaycee. Investigators pursued every registered sex offender in the region. California's registry was still young and incomplete, but agents cross-referenced known predators within several hundred miles. Dozens were interviewed. Polygraphs were administered. None emerged as credible suspects. Media coverage remained relentless. Local stations ran constant updates. CNN and major networks picked up the story, emphasizing the shocking nature of a daylight abduction in a small, safe community. Terry Probin appeared at press conferences, often holding Jaycee's favorite pink stuffed rabbit. Her pleas were heartbreaking. "Please, if you have my daughter, let her go. She needs to come home." Carl Probin also spoke publicly, though his interviews drew scrutiny. Some questioned his story about chasing the car on a bicycle. Tabloid speculation began. Despite passing polygraph tests and cooperating fully, Carl found himself under public suspicion, adding immense stress to an already devastated family. Community support was extraordinary. Volunteers organized search parties that continued for weeks. Pink ribbons spread beyond Tahoe. Fundraisers supported reward money and poster printing. ChildQuest International established a permanent presence to coordinate efforts. By late June, tens of thousands of flyers had been distributed across the country. Gas stations, supermarkets, rest stops, all displayed Jaycee's face. The Carol Shelby Children's Foundation offered $50,000. The total reward climbed past $100,000. As summer became fall, the physical searches gradually scaled back. The Tahoe wilderness is vast and unforgiving. After months of exhaustive effort, investigators concluded Jaycee had almost certainly been removed from the immediate area by vehicle. The focus shifted to long-term strategies, managing tips, periodic media appeals, database cross-checks. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children added Jaycee to their highest priority cases. Age-progressed images were created and circulated. Billboards appeared along California highways. Years passed. No breaks came. Each anniversary brought renewed media coverage and candlelight vigils. Terry Probin kept Jaycee's bedroom untouched, exactly as it had been the morning she left. The pink ribbons faded but remained tied to trees along Washone Boulevard. Behind the scenes, the case file expanded with thousands of investigated and eliminated leads. FBI agents periodically re-examined evidence, searching for links to similar crimes. Composite sketches were updated as witnesses were re-interviewed. The gray sedan remained a persistent thread. Despite nationwide law enforcement alerts, no vehicle was ever found that matched both the physical description and any forensic connection to Jaycee. The suspects had vanished. What no one searching those mountains knew, what no investigator could have imagined, was that Jaycee was not lost in wilderness. She was not across state lines in some hidden cabin. She was 170 miles away, locked in a backyard shed in a quiet suburban neighborhood. And the man holding her captive was not some unknown predator. He was a registered sex offender under active parole supervision. A man whose criminal history should have made him one of the first people investigators looked at. A man living at an address that parole officers would visit more than 60 times over the next 18 years without ever discovering what was hidden behind the back fence. To understand how this could happen, we need to go back 15 years before Jaycee was born, to a crime that should have kept the man who took her locked away forever. Philip Craig Garrido was born on April 5, 1951, in Contra Costa County, California. His early life in the Bay Area suburb of Pittsburgh appeared unremarkable. He was described as quiet, withdrawn, with an interest in music. He played guitar and developed an obsession with sound engineering and amplification. Friends from his teenage years remembered him experimenting heavily with LSD and methamphetamine. He would later claim these drugs triggered religious visions and gave him the ability to control people's minds through sound and speech. Garrido's criminal record began in the early 1970s with arrests for drug possession and minor offenses. Nothing violent. Nothing that raised serious alarms. That changed on November 22, 1976, when he committed a crime so calculated and brutal it should have ensured he never walked free again. That night, 25-year-old Katie Calloway Hall finished her shift as a casino worker in South Lake Tahoe. She drove to a supermarket in Stateline, Nevada. As she returned to her car, Garrido approached and asked for a ride. Then he attacked her with a stun gun. He handcuffed her, bound her with rope, and drove her across the state line to Reno, Nevada, where he had prepared a storage unit as a prison. For hours, he raped her repeatedly. Hall later testified that Garrido had modified the unit with soundproofing blankets on the walls, lighting, a heater, even a movie projector. This was not impulsive. This was planned. Hall escaped when a police officer, responding to reports of a suspicious vehicle outside the storage facility, knocked on the unit door. Garrido was arrested immediately. Because the abduction crossed state lines from California into Nevada, it became a federal case. In 1977, Garrido pleaded guilty to kidnapping and was sentenced in federal court to 50 years in prison. Nevada added a life sentence for rape to run concurrently. Court-ordered psychiatric evaluations painted a chilling picture. One federal report labeled Garrido a sexual deviant with considerable potential for future offenses. Another psychiatrist documented his extreme narcissism and delusional thinking, including beliefs that he could read minds and that women secretly wanted his advances. These were not minor concerns. These were red flags written in bold letters across his file. And yet, in August 1988, after serving only 11 years, Garrido was granted parole. The United States Parole Commission approved his release over strong objections from the original sentencing judge and prosecutors. The decision was based partly on his participation in prison drug programs and letters of support, including one from his father promising supervision. Garrido was transferred briefly to Nevada State Supervision, then released on federal parole. Almost immediately, he moved back to California. He settled in Antioch, a working-class city in Contra Costa County, roughly 170 miles west of South Lake Tahoe. The house at 1554 Walnut Avenue belonged to his elderly mother, Patricia, who suffered from dementia and lived in the front residence. Philip and his new wife, Nancy Bocanegra Garrido, took over the backyard. Nancy's story is its own tragedy. She had been married to a childhood friend of Philip's. In 1981, while Philip was incarcerated at Leavenworth Federal Prison in Kansas, Nancy began visiting him. She was 25, living in Colorado. Through years of letters and visits, Philip convinced her to divorce her husband and marry him by proxy in a prison ceremony in 1984. When he was paroled in 1988, Nancy joined him in Antioch. By 1991, Philip Garrido was 40 years old and under federal parole supervision. His conditions were clear: regular reporting, mandatory drug testing, and absolutely no contact with minors. A parole officer was assigned to monitor compliance through periodic home visits and checks. Neighbors in Antioch noticed Garrido immediately. He stood in his front yard for hours, preaching loudly about God and his supposed ability to control sound waves. He printed business cards for a one-man operation called God's Desire Printing and distributed rambling religious pamphlets around town. He installed massive speakers in the backyard and blasted amplified music or his own voice recordings late into the night. Residents called the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office repeatedly to complain about noise and erratic behavior. Deputies responded multiple times. But because the complaints were non-criminal disturbances, they typically just asked him to lower the volume and left. No one ever looked into the backyard, which was already being concealed by tall wooden fences, tarps, and rapidly growing vegetation. What almost no one knew in 1991 was that Philip Garrido was already building something behind that house. For 3 years, he had been constructing a hidden compound. A maze of sheds, tents, and outbuildings. Some were soundproofed with carpet and foam. He installed locks that only opened from the outside. He ran extension cords for electricity. He dug drainage systems. The entire structure was shielded from street view by a 6-foot wooden privacy fence reinforced with plywood, tarps, and a row of conifer trees. Investigators searching for Jaycee in June 1991 had no reason to connect her disappearance to Philip Garrido. His prior offense had occurred 15 years earlier. It involved an adult victim, not a child. The method, a blitz attack on a lone woman, was superficially similar, but the victim age difference and the fact that Garrido had no gray sedan registered to his name kept him completely off investigative radar. Moreover, in 1991, parole records and missing persons databases were not integrated the way they are now. Cross-referencing was manual, slow, and incomplete. In the years immediately after Jaycee's abduction, Garrido's parole file documented violations. Failed drug tests for methamphetamine. Missed appointments. But each time, he avoided serious consequences through participation in treatment programs or probation extensions. Then, in the mid-1990s, a bureaucratic shift occurred that would prove catastrophic. Garrido's supervision was transferred from federal parole to California state parole due to jurisdictional changes in federal law. When the transfer happened, critical information was lost. The California system received incomplete files. Psychiatric warnings from the 1970s were not fully reviewed. The premeditated, sadistic nature of his original crime was not adequately flagged. Under state supervision, Garrido was classified as a standard-tier sex offender rather than the highest risk category, partly because his conviction predated California's modern 3-tier system. His assigned parole agents carried crushing caseloads, often 50 to 70 high-risk offenders each. Home visits were supposed to occur monthly. In reality, they were sometimes less frequent. And here is where the failures became inexcusable. Between 1991 and 2009, parole agents visited 1554 Walnut Avenue more than 60 times. Some visits were scheduled. Some were unannounced. But every single agent who came to that house did the exact same thing. They stayed in the front. They spoke with Philip or his mother Patricia in the tidy living room. They checked for obvious prohibited items like weapons or pornography. And then they left. Not one agent ever walked into the backyard, even though parole conditions explicitly authorized warrantless searches of the entire property. When the gray sedan carrying 11-year-old Jaycee Dugard pulled into the driveway at 1554 Walnut Avenue on the afternoon of June 10, 1991, her entire world collapsed into terror. Philip Garrido drove directly into the backyard through a side gate, shielding the car from the street. He and Nancy carried Jaycee, stunned and shaking, into one of the small outbuildings already prepared for exactly this purpose. The first space Jaycee was locked inside was a soundproofed shed. 7 feet by 7 feet. Carpet covered the walls. A single mattress sat on the floor. A bucket served as a toilet. A small heater provided minimal warmth. The door had a lock on the outside only. Extension cords snaked through dirt to power a single lamp and a radio. This became Jaycee's entire world. For the first several years, she lived in this shed and a series of connected tents Garrido added over time. He built methodically. The compound grew into a concealed maze enclosed by multiple fencing layers, a 6-foot wooden privacy fence reinforced with tarps, plywood, and fast-growing vines and trees blocking all views from neighboring properties. Inside, he erected canvas tents, additional wooden sheds, and even a small studio where he pursued his obsession with recording religious messages and music. By the mid-1990s, the compound included several locked rooms, outdoor areas covered with blue tarps for shade, a makeshift outdoor shower, a propane stove for cooking, and piles of debris, old cars, broken appliances, junk that further obscured sight lines. Electricity was jerry-rigged from the main house through extension cords. Water came from a garden hose. Every detail was designed for one purpose: concealment and total control. Garrido controlled Jaycee through threats, isolation, and relentless psychological manipulation. He told her that her family did not want her anymore. That they had stopped looking. That the outside world was filled with danger and demons. That he and Nancy were protecting her. He warned that if she tried to escape, his guard dogs would catch her. Or police would find her and punish her. He fed her a steady diet of his delusional religious beliefs, that he was a prophet chosen by God, that he could control minds through sound, that everything happening was part of a divine plan she could not understand. Food was minimal. Fast food in the early days. Then canned goods. Sandwiches. Whatever Nancy cooked in the main house and brought outside. Jaycee was almost never allowed into the front house during the first decade. Showers were infrequent. Hygiene was severely limited. Clothing was whatever Garrido provided, usually secondhand and ill-fitting. In 1994, when Jaycee was just 14 years old, she gave birth to her first daughter. The baby was delivered in the backyard compound. Nancy assisted. No doctor. No hospital. No medical professional of any kind. 3 years later, in 1997, Jaycee gave birth to a second daughter. Again, in the backyard. Again, with only Nancy present. These two girls grew up knowing nothing but the hidden world behind those fences. Garrido told them the outside was filled with demons. That he was their protector. They were homeschooled sporadically using old workbooks and whatever materials Nancy brought back from rare shopping trips. As the children grew, living conditions improved slightly, not from compassion, but necessity. By the early 2000s, the girls had their own tents with actual beds, a small play area, even a television and VCR for movies. Garrido installed a portable air conditioner for summer heat and space heaters for winter cold. Sometimes the family ate meals together under the tarps. Jaycee and her daughters helped with daily chores, cooking, cleaning, tending a small vegetable garden, and later, assisting with Garrido's printing business by stuffing envelopes and preparing flyers. In 1995, a utility worker came to check the gas meter. He knocked on the front door. Nancy answered. From where he stood on the porch, he could hear faint music coming from somewhere behind the house. He asked Nancy if someone was working back there. She smiled and said it was just a radio her husband used while doing yard work. The worker nodded, marked his clipboard, and left. 40 feet away, 14-year-old Jaycee sat in a soundproofed shed, 7 months pregnant with her first daughter, unaware that rescue had just walked past. From outside the compound, glimpses were rare and fleeting. Neighbors occasionally heard children's voices. Some saw small figures moving behind the fences. But the property layout made clear visibility nearly impossible. One resident later recalled hearing a child say hello over the fence sometime in the late 1990s. When she looked up, only Philip Garrido stared back at her. She walked away. Another neighbor remembered briefly seeing young girls in the driveway during the mid-2000s but assumed they were visiting grandchildren or relatives. Garrido's bizarre public behavior actually helped deflect suspicion. His constant preaching, religious rants, wild appearance, long unkempt hair, intense staring eyes, non-stop talk about God, made people avoid him rather than engage. Most neighbors labeled him the local crazy man and kept their distance. Several called the sheriff's non-emergency line over the years about excessive noise or trash blowing into yards. Deputies responded. They stayed in the front. They asked Garrido to turn down music. They left. In later years, as Jaycee's daughters reached their teens, Garrido occasionally allowed brief, tightly controlled outings. Always with him or Nancy. Always with strict instructions on what to say if spoken to. The girls were told to call him daddy in public and to say they were a homeschooling Christian family. Jaycee, by then in her late 20s, was introduced as an employee or distant relative when necessary. These trips to grocery stores, fast food restaurants, or parks were rare and intensely monitored. By 2009, the compound had become a bizarre, self-contained world. Jaycee's daughters, now 15 and 11, had never attended school. Never seen a doctor. Had no birth certificates. No social security numbers. No official existence. Jaycee had not spoken her real name in 18 years. She had learned to survive, to adapt, to protect her children within the only reality they had ever known. She helped run the printing business. She endured the captivity because she had no choice. And this entire hidden nightmare sat just 40 feet from a public sidewalk in a neighborhood where children rode bicycles and families walked dogs every single day. Delivery drivers came and went. Utility workers checked meters. And parole officers visited regularly. More than 60 times. Yet no one breached the barriers Garrido had so carefully built. The compound existed because of a perfect storm, one man's cunning, one woman's complicity, and a catastrophic, repeated, unforgivable system failure. The system failures in Jaycee Dugard's case are not just disappointing. They are enraging. Philip Garrido was under active parole supervision for nearly the entire 18 years he held Jaycee and her daughters captive. Between 1988, when he was released from federal prison, and 2009, when Jaycee was finally discovered, parole agents visited the Walnut Avenue property more than 60 times. Some visits were scheduled. Some were surprise checks. It did not matter. Not one agent ever walked into the backyard where 3 lives were imprisoned. Federal parole managed Garrido's case initially after his 1988 release from Leavenworth. A Bay Area-based federal officer handled supervision. Monthly reports were filed. Drug tests were administered. Home visits occurred. Garrido's file documented ongoing methamphetamine use. It noted his increasingly bizarre religious rants. But violations were handled with warnings, brief jail stays, or treatment programs. Full revocation never came. Then, in 1999, a critical turning point occurred. Changes in federal law transferred many older federal parolees to state supervision. Garrido's case moved to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation. The transfer was a disaster. California received incomplete files. Psychiatric evaluations from the 1970s, which explicitly warned that Garrido had high potential for reoffending, were not fully reviewed or prioritized. Details about the premeditation and sadism of his original 1976 crime were underemphasized. Under California's system, Garrido was classified as a mid-tier sex offender instead of the highest risk category, partly because his conviction predated modern classification standards. The agents assigned to him carried overwhelming caseloads, 50 to 70 high-risk offenders each. Monthly home visits were policy. In practice, they happened less often. And when they did happen, they followed a pattern. Agents arrived at the front door. They spoke with Philip or his elderly mother Patricia in the clean, organized living room. They checked for obvious violations, weapons, pornography, drugs in plain sight. They asked a few questions. Then they left. The backyard, which parole conditions explicitly allowed them to search without a warrant, was never inspected. Not once in 60 visits. Several incidents should have triggered immediate, intensive scrutiny. In 2002, a parole agent noted in Garrido's file that he was operating a printing business from the residence and claimed to have multiple people helping him. The agent wrote it down. The agent did not ask to meet these helpers. Did not ask where the work was being done. Just noted it and moved on. In 2004, a different agent documented that Garrido had constructed additional structures in the backyard, including tents and sheds that were visible in satellite imagery accessible to law enforcement. The note was filed. No follow-up occurred. But the system's failures were not over. In fact, the most glaring missed opportunity was still 2 years away. And when it came, it would involve a 911 call, a sheriff's deputy standing at Garrido's front door for 30 minutes, and a decision that would haunt the investigation for the rest of its existence. The most inexcusable failure came in November 2006. A neighbor, increasingly disturbed by strange noises and activity, called 911. He told the dispatcher he believed people were living in tents in Garrido's backyard. He said he could hear children's voices. Contra Costa County Sheriff's Deputy Michael Bradley was dispatched. Bradley arrived at the house and knocked on the front door. Garrido answered. Bradley explained that a neighbor had reported people living in tents and voices of children coming from the backyard. Garrido calmly explained that he ran a church back there. That his daughters sometimes visited with their children. Bradley asked if he could see the backyard. Garrido refused. He said it was private property and that Bradley would need a warrant. And here is the moment that haunts this case. Deputy Bradley stood at that door for 30 minutes. He knew Philip Garrido was a convicted rapist and kidnapper. He had just been told by a concerned citizen that children's voices were coming from the backyard. He had the legal authority to contact Garrido's parole officer, who could conduct a warrantless search of the entire property immediately. But he did not do that. He did not press. He did not call parole. He accepted Garrido's refusal, wrote a brief report labeling it a welfare check, and left. 40 feet away, behind a fence, Jaycee and her 2 daughters remained hidden. 2 years later, in July 2008, another failure occurred. A parole agent conducting a routine visit briefly saw a young girl, Jaycee's younger daughter, then 11 years old, peeking out from behind a curtain inside the front house. The agent asked Garrido who she was. Garrido said she was his brother's daughter, visiting from out of state. The agent accepted this explanation. Did not document the sighting. Did not ask for identification. Did not verify the story. Just moved on. In 2007, California began fitting high-risk sex offenders with GPS ankle monitors as part of a new tracking initiative. Garrido was given one. The device recorded his movements continuously. Data showed he spent almost all his time at the Walnut Avenue address. The monitor also flagged minor violations, low battery alerts, brief trips outside approved zones. But this data was reviewed by a centralized monitoring unit, not Garrido's direct parole agent. No one connected the constant home presence with the possibility of hidden victims. No one asked why a man under supervision for kidnapping and rape was spending nearly every hour at a property with concealed structures in the backyard. Over 18 years, at least 10 different parole agents were assigned to Garrido's case. High turnover meant continuity was lost. Each new agent inherited a thick file but rarely read it thoroughly. Red flags accumulated separately: failed drug tests, neighbor complaints, reports of backyard construction, unexplained children seen briefly. But these flags were never assembled into a coherent pattern that screamed danger. They were treated as isolated data points, filed away, forgotten. After Jaycee's rescue in 2009, the California Office of the Inspector General launched an exhaustive investigation. The report released in 2010 was devastating. It identified 35 separate opportunities where proper adherence to protocols could have led directly to discovering the backyard compound. It found that parole agents failed to use even basic investigative techniques. Supervisors did not review case files adequately. Risk assessment tools consistently underestimated Garrido's threat level. The Inspector General also sharply criticized the 1999 transfer from federal to state supervision, noting that California agents were never properly briefed on the calculated, predatory nature of Garrido's original crime or the psychiatric warnings about his likelihood to commit future offenses. Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office faced scrutiny as well. Between 1991 and 2009, deputies responded to the Walnut Avenue property at least 12 times for noise complaints, welfare checks, and disturbances. Every single time, they stayed in the front yard or driveway. Not one deputy insisted on inspecting the entire property. These were not failures caused by one negligent person. This was systemic collapse, crushing caseloads, inadequate training on supervising sex offenders, poor communication between agencies, and a dangerous culture of accepting surface-level compliance from parolees without verification. By August 2009, Jaycee had been captive for 18 years, 2 months, and 15 days. Her daughters had never known freedom. The backyard compound had evolved into a complex of locked gates within gates, soundproofed rooms, and concealed spaces. And still, the parole visits continued. Agents knocked on the front door. Accepted Garrido's explanations. Left without ever realizing 3 lives were hidden just steps away. It would take something entirely different, something completely outside the parole system, to bring this nightmare into the light. By the summer of 2009, Philip Garrido's delusions had reached a fever pitch. He believed God had given him a message that would change the world. For years, he had been writing what he called a manifesto about his supposed ability to control sound waves and cure sexual deviancy through divine intervention. He claimed angels spoke directly to him, instructing him to share this revelation publicly. He printed rambling blog posts, composed songs, and prepared documents with titles like Origin of Schizophrenia Revealed. And he decided the perfect place to spread this message was the University of California, Berkeley, a campus famous for free speech and open public discourse. On August 24, 2009, Garrido loaded a folder of his writings and drove his 2 daughters, then 15 and 11 years old, on a 40-minute trip from Antioch to the Berkeley campus. Jaycee stayed behind in the compound. The next day, August 25, Garrido returned to campus with the girls. This time, he went to the university's event services office. He wanted permission to hold a religious event he called God's Desire on campus grounds the following week. He planned to bring amplifiers, distribute pamphlets, and preach publicly about his beliefs. The staff member he spoke with directed him to Lisa Campbell, the campus police department's special events manager. Lisa Campbell was not just an administrator. She was a former correctional officer with years of experience reading people, spotting inconsistencies, sensing danger. When Garrido entered her office with the 2 girls standing silently behind him, every instinct she had developed over her career started firing. Garrido spoke rapidly, almost manically, about angels, mind control, sound waves, his divine mission. His eyes were intense, unfocused, wild. But what disturbed Campbell most was not Garrido. It was the girls. They were pale. Expressionless. They stared straight ahead with blank eyes. When Campbell tried to engage them directly, asking simple, friendly questions like "What are your names" or "Do you like school?" the girls did not respond immediately. They looked at Garrido first. Only after he gave a slight nod did they answer in soft, rehearsed, robotic voices. The older girl said her name was Alyssa. The younger said Angel. Their answers sounded scripted, lifeless. Campbell had seen controlled behavior before. This was extreme. She told Garrido she would review his request and asked for his contact information. He handed her a business card for God's Desire Printing and provided an email address. Then he left with the girls. The moment they were gone, Campbell turned to her colleague, UC Berkeley police officer Ally Jacobs. She described the encounter in detail and said, "Those girls were like Stepford children. Something is very, very wrong." Jacobs trusted Campbell's instincts. She agreed to dig deeper. That same afternoon, Jacobs ran a basic background check on Philip Craig Garrido using standard law enforcement databases. What came back stopped her cold. Philip Garrido was a registered sex offender. Federal conviction. Kidnapping and rape. 1976. The case details were right there: abduction of a 25-year-old woman near South Lake Tahoe, hours of sexual assault in a storage unit he had prepared in advance. Jacobs immediately understood the severity. A man with this history should not be walking around a university campus with two young girls who appeared to be under his complete psychological control. Campbell and Jacobs debated their next move. As campus police, they had limited jurisdiction off university property. But they knew Garrido had to be on parole. Jacobs made the call. She contacted the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation and reached Garrido's assigned parole officer, Eddie Santos. She explained everything: the campus visit, the request for a religious event, the presence of two young girls exhibiting disturbing behavior, and Garrido's criminal history. She expressed serious concern for the children's welfare, describing their blank expressions and total dependence on Garrido for even the simplest responses. Santos pulled Garrido's file immediately. He scanned through it. There was no mention anywhere of Garrido having daughters. Parole records listed no children living at the Walnut Avenue address. None. Santos told Jacobs he would handle it. He would schedule an immediate compliance check and investigate. Jacobs asked him to keep her updated. The next morning, August 26, Philip Garrido returned to the UC Berkeley campus police office, again with the two girls. He wanted to follow up on his event permit application and brought additional documents. Campbell and Jacobs saw him arrive. They stalled, telling him they were still reviewing his request, while Jacobs quietly alerted Eddie Santos that Garrido was on campus right now with the children. Santos did not hesitate. He instructed his supervisor to authorize an immediate parole hold. He got in his car and drove to Berkeley. He told campus police to detain Garrido for parole violations, specifically bringing minors onto a university campus without prior approval, among other concerns. He also ordered the girls separated for individual questioning. At approximately 1:30 in the afternoon, Philip Garrido was taken into custody in a campus police interview room. The two girls were placed in a separate room with a trained female officer. When questioned gently, the girls gave inconsistent, evasive answers about basic facts, their ages, their schooling, where their mother was. They claimed they were homeschooled. They said their mother was out running errands. Their stories did not align. They seemed confused, frightened, but also strangely detached. Santos arrived and began interviewing Garrido directly. At first, Garrido stuck to his rehearsed story. The girls were his daughters with his wife Nancy. They were a religious homeschooling family. Nothing unusual. But Santos pressed. He pointed out inconsistencies. He reminded Garrido that parole records showed no children at his address. He asked specific questions Garrido could not answer smoothly. And slowly, away from the girls, Garrido began to unravel. He admitted the girls were not Nancy's biological children. He claimed they belonged to a girlfriend who had left him years ago and he was just helping raise them. Then, in a rambling, almost incoherent confession, he said something that made Santos lean forward. "There are no victims here. I've completely turned my life around. You have no idea what I've been through. I have something so big it will blow your minds." Santos pushed harder. "What does that mean, Philip? What are you talking about?" Garrido's story shifted again. He said he had made mistakes in the past, but everything at home would explain it all. He asked if the girls could just be released to their mother. That word, mother, hung in the air. Santos immediately contacted the Antioch Police Department and requested an emergency welfare check at 1554 Walnut Avenue. He told them to proceed with extreme caution. Possible kidnapping victim. Possible children at risk. Antioch officers arrived at the house within 30 minutes. They knocked. Nancy Garrido answered the door. She was visibly nervous, stammering, evasive. Officers asked if anyone else was home. Nancy said yes, a woman named Alyssa who helped with the printing business. Officers asked to speak with her. Nancy hesitated, then led them inside. Sitting in the living room was a 29-year-old woman. Thin. Pale. Long blonde hair. Officers asked her name. She said Alyssa. She supported Nancy's story. Said the girls were hers. Said everything was fine. But one of the officers, a female detective, sensed the same thing Lisa Campbell had sensed. Something was off. She asked if she could speak with Alyssa privately, away from Nancy. Alyssa agreed. They moved to another room. The detective closed the door. She sat down across from the woman and spoke gently. "You're safe now. You can tell me the truth. Who are you really?" For a long moment, there was silence. Then the woman's composure cracked. Her hands started shaking. Tears filled her eyes. And in a quiet, trembling voice, she said the words that would break an 18-year mystery wide open. "I'm Jaycee Dugard. I was kidnapped in 1991 when I was 11. The detective asked if she was okay. Jaycee shook her head slowly. "No. I have 2 daughters. They're out there. With him." Within hours, 1554 Walnut Avenue was locked down as a major crime scene. Multiple agencies converged. FBI. El Dorado County Sheriff. Contra Costa Sheriff. Search teams moved into the backyard and discovered the full horror of what had been hidden there for 18 years. Locked sheds. Soundproofed rooms. Tents connected by tarps. Layers of fencing. Children's toys scattered in the dirt. Clothing. Journals. Makeshift utilities running through extension cords. Evidence of long-term human habitation in conditions that could only be described as imprisonment. Jaycee and her daughters were taken to a secure reunification site, a local motel under heavy FBI protection. DNA samples were collected. Within hours, the results confirmed what investigators already knew. This was Jaycee Lee Dugard. The girl taken from a school bus stop in South Lake Tahoe on June 10, 1991. The girl whose face had been on flyers across the country. The girl thousands had searched for. The girl many had assumed was dead. On the evening of August 27, 2009, Terry Probin received a phone call she had waited 18 years to get. FBI agents on the line told her 4 words that seemed impossible. "We found your daughter. Jaycee is alive." News broke nationally that same night. Every major network led with the story. The gray sedan abduction from 1991. The pink ribbons. The cold case that had haunted South Lake Tahoe for nearly 2 decades. Solved. Not in some distant location. But in a backyard 170 miles away, in a house visited by law enforcement more than 60 times. Philip and Nancy Garrido were arrested immediately and charged with 29 felony counts: kidnapping, rape, false imprisonment, lewd acts with a minor. The rescue had taken less than 48 hours from the moment Lisa Campbell first saw those 2 silent, pale girls standing behind Philip Garrido in her office and trusted her gut that something was catastrophically wrong. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. The reunion between Jaycee Dugard and her family on August 27, 2009, was a moment 18 years in the making. Jaycee, now 29 years old, met her mother, Terry Probin, and her aunt Tina in a private room at an undisclosed location arranged by the FBI. Terry had carried Jaycee's childhood photo in her wallet every single day since June 10, 1991. She had attended vigils. Spoken at press conferences. Never stopped believing her daughter was alive somewhere. When Jaycee walked into that room, Terry later said she knew immediately. Those same blue eyes. The shape of her face. Despite everything, despite 18 years, she recognized her daughter instantly. They embraced. And for a long time, neither of them could speak. Jaycee's younger sister, Shayna, was also there. Shayna had been less than 2 years old when Jaycee was taken. She had no memory of her sister. Now she was 20. Meeting Jaycee for the first time as an adult was overwhelming, emotional, but also gentle. Jaycee's two daughters, 15 and 11, were introduced to their grandmother, their aunt, an entire family they had never known existed. The girls had grown up being told the outside world was dangerous, that Philip Garrido was their protector, that leaving meant death. Now they were surrounded by strangers who were family, trying to process a reality that contradicted everything they had ever been taught. In the weeks following the rescue, Jaycee and her daughters entered protective custody. They were relocated to a safe house. Their identities were temporarily shielded from media. Medical examinations revealed that none of the three had seen a doctor in 18 years. Basic health needs were addressed immediately. Vaccinations were updated. Dental work began. An intensive psychological counseling started, aimed at helping all three process unimaginable trauma. The legal system moved quickly. Philip and Nancy Garrido were charged in El Dorado County, the jurisdiction where Jaycee had originally been abducted, with 29 felony counts. The charges included kidnapping, rape by force, false imprisonment, and lewd acts with a child under 14. Both initially entered not guilty pleas. But as evidence mounted, physical evidence from the compound, journals, photographs, video recordings, and Jaycee's own detailed testimony, their legal positions collapsed. On April 28, 2011, Philip Garrido changed his plea to guilty on all counts. The plea deal spared him the death penalty. On June 2, 2011, he appeared in court for sentencing. The judge called his crimes monstrous and depraved. Philip Craig Garrido was sentenced to 431 years to life in prison. The judge stated clearly for the record that the sentence ensured Garrido would never, under any circumstances, walk free again. Nancy Garrido also accepted a plea agreement. She pleaded guilty to kidnapping and rape, acknowledging her active, willing participation in both the abduction and the 18 years of captivity that followed. Prosecutors made it clear, Nancy was not a passive bystander. She had grabbed Jaycee and pulled her into the car. She had helped construct and maintain the backyard prison. She had assisted in the births of Jaycee's daughters and enforced the isolation for nearly 2 decades. On June 2, 2011, the same day as Philip, Nancy Garrido was sentenced to 36 years to life. The sentences brought formal justice. But the public, the media, and investigators immediately turned their focus to the question everyone was asking: how did this happen? How was Jaycee held captive for 18 years in a location visited more than 60 times by law enforcement? The California Office of the Inspector General launched an exhaustive, no-holds-barred investigation. The resulting report, released in 2010, was scathing. It documented 35 separate missed opportunities where proper execution of standard parole protocols could have, and should have, led to the discovery of the backyard compound. The report found that parole agents repeatedly violated basic supervision procedures. Supervisors failed to review case files with appropriate diligence. Risk assessment tools were applied incorrectly, consistently underestimating Garrido's danger to the community. The Inspector General also heavily criticized the 1999 transfer of Garrido's case from federal to state parole, noting that California agents were never adequately briefed on the calculated, predatory, sadistic nature of his original 1976 crime or the psychiatric evaluations that explicitly warned of his high potential to re-offend. In response to these findings, California Governor Arnold Schwarzenegger issued a public apology to Jaycee Dugard and her family on behalf of the state. He acknowledged that the system had failed her catastrophically. Several parole officials were disciplined. Some were reassigned. Policy changes were immediate and sweeping. California overhauled its entire sex offender supervision system. Caseloads for agents supervising high-risk offenders were reduced. GPS monitoring protocols were strengthened. And most critically, mandatory full property searches, including all outbuildings and concealed areas, were reinforced and made non-negotiable for high-risk parolees. Contra Costa County Sheriff Warren Ruff also issued a formal public apology for the 2006 welfare check that failed to discover the compound. Deputy Bradley's decision to leave without searching the backyard, despite being told children were living in tents, became a case study in law enforcement training nationwide. The Sheriff's Department implemented new protocols emphasizing the importance of interagency cooperation, particularly partnerships with parole officers who have broader search authority. Jaycee Dugard filed civil lawsuits against both the federal government and the state of California for gross negligence in the supervision of Philip Garrido. In 2010, California settled for $20 million, publicly acknowledging the profound, life-altering harm caused by repeated system failures. The federal lawsuit was settled separately in 2011 for an undisclosed sum. With the settlement funds, Jaycee established the Jaycee Foundation in 2010. The name stands for Just Ask Yourself to Care. The foundation's mission is to support families dealing with abduction, trauma, and recovery. It has provided therapy animals, counseling grants, family reunification resources, and transitional support for families navigating the aftermath of horrific experiences. Jaycee chose a path of gradual, careful re-engagement with the world. In 2011, she published a memoir titled A Stolen Life. The book, written entirely in her own words, became an immediate bestseller. It offered the first detailed public account from Jaycee's perspective, focusing not on graphic details of abuse, but on survival, motherhood, resilience, and the quiet strength required to endure the unendurable. In 2016, she released a second book, Freedom, My Book of Firsts, which chronicled her experiences after rescue. The book celebrated simple joys many take for granted, tasting different ice cream flavors, learning to drive a car, watching her daughters attend school for the first time, experiencing seasons of normal life. Jaycee's daughters adapted remarkably well given the circumstances. They enrolled in school, made friends, pursued interests and hobbies, experienced the ordinary teenage years that had been stolen from them. Jaycee has remained fiercely protective of their privacy, rarely granting media access and ensuring they have space to heal away from public scrutiny. The property at 1554 Walnut Avenue in Antioch was demolished in 2012. For years after Jaycee's rescue, it had become a grim tourist attraction, with people driving by slowly, taking photos, leaving flowers. Neighbors had endured the attention long enough. The demolition was welcomed. The lot was cleared. The backyard compound, the sheds, the fences, the tarps, all of it was erased. The pink ribbons that had hung on trees in South Lake Tahoe for 18 years, faded and weathered but never removed, were finally taken down. Investigators who had worked the original 1991 case, many of whom had carried Jaycee's photo and attended annual vigils for nearly 2 decades, closed the file with deep, conflicting emotions. There was profound relief that Jaycee was alive. But there was also lasting regret over what might have been discovered years, even a decade, earlier if the system had functioned as it should have. Today, Jaycee Dugard lives quietly with her family. She advocates for survivors when she chooses to, but her primary focus remains healing and building a life defined by normalcy, not trauma. In a rare 2016 interview, she said something that captured her entire approach to survival. "I don't dwell on what was taken from me. I focus on what I have now. My daughters. My family. My freedom." The case of Jaycee Lee Dugard remains one of the longest confirmed stranger abduction survivals in recorded history. It exposed systemic flaws in parole supervision, interagency communication, and risk assessment that led to sweeping reforms across California and influenced policy nationwide. But it also demonstrated something equally powerful, the impact of human instinct. 2 women, Lisa Campbell and Ally Jacobs, working in a campus police office, saw something wrong and refused to ignore it. They trusted their gut. They made the calls. They asked the questions. And because of that, 3 lives were saved. What happened to Jaycee Dugard and her daughters was cruelty on a scale difficult to comprehend, enabled by oversight failures equally difficult to forgive. But their story is not only about what was stolen. It is about survival. About reunion. About a mother and daughter separated for 18 years who found each other again. And about the quiet, determined strength it takes to rebuild a life after everything has been taken away. Jaycee Dugard was stolen at 11. She was found at 29. But she was never broken. And that, more than any system failure or parole report, is what this case is truly about. If this case mattered to you, if you believe stories like Jaycee's deserve to be told, remembered, and learned from, subscribe to Cold Case Beacon. Drop a comment below sharing your thoughts on this investigation. And stay with us as we continue shining light on the cases the world tried to forget. Thank you for watching. And thank you for remembering Jaycee.